When I started working on this presentation, I spent a week but couldn't progress much. Then I discussed with Alex also 3-4 days back. Later, I reviewed some study material from the ABT candidate handbook and realized that there is no separate section mentioned as a regulatory toxicology because I was not aware how the syllabus is. So I just reviewed the candidate handbook. I then studied the regulatory toxicology sections thoroughly from the two books, that is Casseret and Dulles book, and one is from the Hayes book. And then I thought, because it's not a straightforward subject, regulatory toxicology, like general toxicology, genetic toxicology, or carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, principles of toxicology, all other chapters, metals, pesticide toxicity. There are some clear points, guidelines actually, but in the regulatory toxicology, either in Casseret and Dulles, because that is the main reference book for ABT, and also in the Hayes book, there are no clear points which can actually I can put it in the presentation. And then I thought I could put some certain things actually to give an overview of regulatory toxicology to the ABT candidates. And then we will discuss more on that part. And risk assessment is a major topic that is in the syllabus and also an important part of regulatory toxicology. But I think that regulatory toxicology, this risk assessment is already covered by earlier somebody else, and it was very good actually in two different lectures. So I'm not going to cover much detail, but I'll focus on that also because otherwise there is nothing. In this regulatory toxicology, basically in both the books or in the syllabus of this ABT currently, they expect that you should know all the regulatory guidelines thoroughly, not only the titles, guideline contents, I mean guidelines, particularly earlier focus during earlier times, it was mainly the ICH guidelines and EPA guidelines, or I can say OPPTS guidelines. But now they expanded it to the global guidelines also. So there are questions on the OECD guidelines. Apart from that, there are questions on EFSA, European Food Safety Authority guidelines, WHO guidelines, and many other different guidelines, even the Health Canada guidelines. But major focus is on the ICH guidelines, that is guidelines followed by the US FDA for pharmaceutical products, and the EPA guidelines, that is basically for pesticides, chemicals, and other chemicals. That will come later actually. So these guidelines, they are candidate or whosoever is appearing for examination, you should be thorough. It's the same thing like the syllabus for the regulatory affairs certification is different, although, but if you appear for the regulatory affairs certification, particularly for the pharmaceuticals or maybe with medical device or maybe for the both, the syllabus is almost same. And here for ABT, the syllabus is so vast that regulatory toxicology completely understanding the risk assessment for all different kinds of products by one person is not possible. So it's an overview of regulatory toxicology. The ABT candidate should be aware. Coming back to the outline of presentation, it's a short introduction about regulatory toxicology, what is regulatory tox, and some regulatory agencies actually, because there are some confusions in the regulatory agencies. People still think the NGCM is a regulatory agency, or maybe the OECD is a regulatory agency. So we'll just talk short on that. Then the important is actually the US regulatory bodies, but majority questions are because it's a ABT examination is conducted by the board in the USA. So most of the focus is on the OECD regulatory authorities, that US regulatory authorities, I mean for FDA and EPA, both for chemicals and pharmaceuticals. And then some ICH, OECD, WHO, international global guidelines are also included, although I have not touched, but there are some questions, or maybe it is also included in the syllabus, that for medical devices, the ISO guideline and AST guidelines are also expected to be thoroughly read by the candidate. Then overview of risk assessment, because it's an important part of the regulatory toxicology. Then artificial intelligence role to some extent, because all these EPA guidelines and FDA guidelines and OECD guidelines, and now they have included some softwares for risk assessment, and these are based on the artificial intelligence. So we'll just in short touch that topic and then summarize the talk. I'll prefer actually, I'll go through the presentations, and maybe at the end, I think I expect many questions actually. Everybody can ask question actually, and we'll discuss the topic more. These are the different branches of toxicology. Regulatory toxicology is an important branch, although it is covered this normally when people, hello? Drupal and Alex, please. Yeah, please tell me if there is any disturbance or anything. Yeah, or maybe clarity. So there are different branches of toxicology, and there are many more branches also. There is no, one may say that reproduction toxicology is a separate branch of toxicology, developmental toxicology is a separate branch, or ecotoxicology is a separate branch, although not covered in this because these are specific. I have taken the material straight away from the Casseret and Dulles book and the Hayes book, and maybe FDA and EPA guidelines. So it's all covered. So regulatory toxicology, they have specifically specified, and whenever we say the safety assessment or any CRO, toxicology CRO or safety assessment CROs are working, they normally consider it as we do the regulatory toxicology work, but it is not the case. So we'll come in the next slide. Actually, whatever we do in the CRO, that is toxicity testing, is comes under the descriptive toxicology. The purpose is basically to be, the data is to be used by the regulatory toxicology or regulators ultimately. That is the purpose. So in short, I'm not going in the detail. Toxicology is study of adverse effects and subdisciplines. These are very three important branches of toxicology, I can say. Otherwise, there are many different classifications of toxicology. The mechanistic toxicology, descriptive toxicology, and regulatory toxicology. And all these branches, all these three branches, the data is collected and the risk assessment is carried out, which is the ultimate purpose of the toxicity testing. What do we do? So regulatory toxicology is the mechanistic toxicology is cellular, biochemical, and molecular mechanisms. It's already covered in the principles and other things already. The toxicity testing, the descriptive toxicology, what we do in the toxicity CROs, preclinical CROs particularly, that is the actual animal testing or in vitro testing, or as per the guidelines. And normally we consider it as a regulatory toxicity, but it is just to meet the regulatory requirements, because regulatory toxicology is little different. We don't do risk assessment, very few CROs do, but we don't do normally up to the end, and that is the regulator's job. So regulatory toxicology is a specialized branch of toxicology, which ultimately use the data received from the descriptive and mechanistic toxicologists, and they evaluate the safety or the risk, I can say, of chemicals. When I say chemicals, always use, it can be pharmaceutical, it can be agrochemical, it can be food additives, etc., or medical devices, and so many other things, to protect the human health and the environment. And this regulatory toxicology plays a crucial role to ensure that the products released in the market, they are comply with the regulatory standards and do not pose any unacceptable hazards. And that is the job of the regulators. So they use this data, and whatever the regulatory toxicology means, how regulators use this toxicity data for ensuring that the safe products are only allowed in the market. So it's basically regulatory toxicology, I can say you always, integration of scientific or toxicological data with regulatory standards. And these regulatory standards are established by regulatory agencies worldwide, different standards. So primary objective of regulatory toxicology is to assess the effects of different substances through the testing and risk assessment. So testing is also part of the regulatory toxicology risk assessment process. And based on these risk assessment processes, regulatory agencies decide whether to approve, whether to restrict, or whether to ban a particular chemical. Again, chemical means it can be pharmaceutical, agrochemical. They decide based on this actually data. So regulatory toxicology involves various types of studies. They use different types of studies and ultimately risk assessment, and they evaluate the important stages. We'll come back to that risk assessment. Regulatory toxicology requires a multidisciplinary approach because they should know everything. And regulatory toxicology, regulatory body, and regulatory toxicologist, they do the same job almost. The regulatory toxicologist must understand both the scientific principles and the legal requirements. It is basically a providing scientific basis for the regulatory decisions. That is what is the descriptive toxicological data. So it's a integration of toxicological science with legal and regulatory framework. What is regulatory body? The government appoints regulatory bodies. Each government, each country's government or each country, they have their own regulatory bodies. It can be sometimes there are different regulatory authorities controlling the regulating the drugs and the agrochemicals and the industrial chemicals and the medical devices, or they are sometimes the same one. Small countries, they have only one regulatory authority, or most of the countries they have two regulatory authorities. One is controlling the pharmaceutical products and another for the chemicals and medical devices and other things. So these regulatory authorities bodies, they make rules and regulations for manufacturing companies. That is the guideline requirements or testing requirements. And it is the responsibility of the regulatory authority body to keep the consumers safe, and only the safe, quality and efficacious products are introduced in the market. So regulatory agencies worldwide oversee the safety, efficacy and quality, the important parameters. And each agency, as I told you, operates within its jurisdiction and often collaborates internationally to harmonize the standards. That's what the ICH and OECD guidelines are. Actually, these are the harmonized guidelines and accepted by most of the countries, although there are small differences. So some regulatory agencies I just listed. These are FDA, USA names and other things. Actually, I'm not going into details of those. These are some of the regulatory bodies. Actually, the majority of these are the pesticide regulatory authorities, which I mentioned, except few. So for pharmaceuticals, there are different regulatory authorities. As I told you, the important one we will discuss in detail, that is US Food and Drug Administration, then European Medical Agency, of course, in Europe, then Japan, UK, India. I'll specifically mention which is the regulatory authority of India, although everybody knows. Then Therapeutic Goods Administration, but still the people working in the agrochemical field, they are not aware of the drug regulatory authority in India, or people working in the pharmaceuticals, they don't know much about the agrochemical or pesticide regulatory authority in India. Then for industrial chemicals, these are the important regulatory authorities. All these are mentioned, actually the regulatory authorities are mentioned in the candidate handbook, or they're specifically mentioned. So, and these are the acts actually, some of the acts or gazettes. For vaccines, there are again, the US Food and Drug Administration controls all medicines and food additives and other chemicals, USA. European Medical Agency, EMA, again is for vaccines and medicines. In Japan also, pharmaceutical and medical devices and vaccines are controlled under the same organization. There are separate guidelines by the WHO for the vaccines particularly, not for medicines, not for the agrochemicals, but there are some guidelines by these World Health Organization which are for classification and labeling of agrochemical products particularly, and even for the pharmaceutical products. And Central Drug Standard Association also, because vaccines and pharmaceutical and medical devices are regulated by the same authority in India. For medical devices, again, there are some different regulatory authorities. Most of these are common, although hardly there is a notified bodies in European Union actually, they also play a role of regulatory authority for controlling these medical devices. Otherwise, in most of the cases, the pharmaceuticals and medical devices are regulated under by the same authorities in most of the countries. Then food additives are controlled by again by the almost the same authorities, except in India now there is a separate authority, Food Safety and Standards Authority for regulating the food additives. It's not new, I can say, but it's a 10 years old maybe. And in Europe also there is a EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. It is separate than the pharmaceutical and agrochemicals. And it's very most of the FDA and EFSA guidelines are almost harmonized. And Health Canada again controlling the food additives as well as the vaccines and the pharmaceutical products in Canada. So these agencies, they regulate, establish the regulations. That is, they sometimes they issue the guidelines of their own, like EPA, or sometimes they adopt even EPA and FDA. FDA adopted the ICH guidelines, or even they accept sometimes the OECD guidelines. And majority of the countries they accept these international guidelines. So I'll touch upon the ICH and OECD guidelines. So many regulatory authorities, they actually participate in harmonization efforts, that is ICH and OECD. So ICH, all these studies or the safety assessments or everything is carried out as per the ICH guidelines on any pharmaceutical product is accepted by most of the countries. Only thing for some particular countries, you have to add certain things actually, otherwise it's a harmonized guidelines. OECD guidelines are specifically for the chemicals. Chemicals means actually these are guidelines for agrochemicals as well as for the industrial chemicals. But because the OECD guidelines are very elaborate guidelines and very harmonized guidelines, people also use these OECD guidelines while designing the study plans for the pharmaceutical products. This is a regulatory authority in India. Although it is not part of any ABT or anything, syllabus, Central Insecticide Board and Registration Committee, they regulate the agrochemicals in India. And definitely because India is a OECD MAD signatory, so they have accepted the OECD guidelines, although there are separate guidelines, Indian guidelines under Insecticide Act 1968. They are little separate, different than the OECD guidelines, but data generated as per OECD guidelines is accepted in the by the Indian Regulatory Authority. And for the drugs in India, there is a Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and this organization actually regulates the pharmaceutical products, medical devices. There is a separate division in the CDSCO for regulating the medical devices, and there are elaborate guidelines, that is medical device regulations 17, first time actually published in 17 and then revised in 2019 and 2022 medical device regulations. And again, vaccines are also regulated by the CDSCO. Only thing, there is a one more regulatory authority in India which I haven't mentioned here is for Department of Biotechnology, but ultimate regulatory authority is the CDSCO. But they have their own requirements, Department of Biotechnology, for recombinant products, whether it is a pharmaceutical, whether it is agrochemical. The organization for this OECD organization, everybody is most of the aware, whether it is from the pharma or agro. It's a intergovernmental organization having 38 industrialized and developing countries. And basically, they coordinate the international efforts to ensure the chemical safety, and they issue the testing guidelines. And these guidelines are revised very frequently, and there is an elaborate process for updating the guidelines, OECD guidelines, and they are always at par with the US EPA. US EPA guidelines are not updated that frequently as the OECD guidelines, but US EPA in their each guideline, they always mention, even in India, they mention that the updated guidelines or the latest guidelines of OECD, the data generated as per these guidelines is accepted by these regulatory authorities. To be just to clear that OECD is not a regulatory authority like ICH. ICH and OECD are the intergovernmental organizations. And the main purpose is that to harmonize the guidelines and to ensure the chemical safety globally. And there are elaborate OECD guidelines. Most of the people are aware. And for ABT examination, actually everybody should be thorough with the contents of these guidelines, all different parts of the guideline, whether it is a ecotoxicology guidelines, whether it is a toxicity health effect guidelines, or whether it is a EFAT. Uh, I'm not sure whether physicochemical study guidelines are also a part of the ABT syllabus, but at least ecotoxicology, genotoxicity, that is again under health effects and general toxicology guidelines. So please note that OECD and ICH, although are very important in terms from the point of regulatory toxicology view, they are not the regulatory authorities or regulatory bodies. So they don't come for any audit. There is no procedure for audit or anything in the OECD or recognitions, or data is not submitted to these authorities. Regulatory authorities are different. Same thing with the international ICH guidelines. Actually, it's founded in 1999 and comprising the pharmaceutical regulatory agencies, specifically from the European Union, all the countries from Europe, Japan, and the United States. And they have issued the harmonized guidelines, and these guidelines are also updated very frequently, and very elaborate guidelines, although not at par with the OECD. So most of the times, the study plan is designed combining the ICH and OECD guidelines for pharmaceuticals and EPA and OECD guidelines for the chemicals or agrochemicals. There are different ICH guidelines, more than 50 guidelines are available actually, and they are categorized, the guidelines, in different categories like quality, safety. It is just an example, but there are different guidelines. I have not mentioned these guidelines. Then, and some are multidisciplinary, but there are lot many questions actually. As I remember, at least um, minimum 10 questions are there on the guidelines, OECD, ICH, and EPA. And nowadays the WHO vaccine guidelines also they are included. The specific regulatory programs utilizing the toxicological data in USA particularly, because the majority questions are, these are the most important actually regulatory authorities. And once the product, whether it is a drug, pharmaceutical product, whether it is a chemical, whether it is a medical device, if it is registered in the US FDA or US EPA, most of the countries, they accept the data. There is no need to generate the data again. Even the majority of the countries, they clearly specify that if it is already registered in USE, you have to just submit the registration certificate, or sometimes very few countries, they ask for the data, or same dossier, rather I can say, not data, dossier, basically. So these are important actually regulatory agencies. And there are 4 important agencies that are chiefly responsible for regulating the human exposure to toxic chemicals. These are some of the actually major toxic chemical laws, and it is expected that the ABT candidate should be thorough with all these regulations actually. And there are questions in different ways. No direct questions. Sometimes there are direct questions. Sometimes there are questions in a different ways. But and I have not listed. These are some of the examples, and these major toxic chemical laws in USA are. Then there are different amendments. These laws are amended many a times actually. If you can see, but these are basic things, and 100% you should be thorough with all these regulations. The US Food and Drug Administration, the oldest of the major health regulation law, was originally, it was enacted in 1906, again amended first time in 1938, and then there are so many other amendments, but major amendment was in 1938. And this US Food and Drug Administration, they regulate food which is used for humans and animals, drugs including the biosimilars or biological drugs, then medical devices, cosmetics, because the act itself is a federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So they also regulate the cosmetics and tobacco products. There are very few regulatory agencies where tobacco products are regulated. There is no regulation for tobacco products in India or in many other countries. But in the US FDA particularly, there are stringent regulations for manufacturing and selling or export and import of these tobacco products. Remember, and there is a separate gazette or act or statute, I can say, under the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act for the cosmetic, tobaccos, medical devices. The Environmental Protection Agency, which regulates the pesticides, although many people know or CRO people know that they regulate the pesticides, but this EPA also regulates the industrial chemicals, the drinking water supplies, the hazardous waste control, and toxic pollutants of water and air. And there are separate statutes or laws for regulating the hazardous waste, toxic pollutants of water and air. It's very elaborate rules are available. These are some of the rules actually, but I'm not going into details of each of these. But as a preparation for ABT, actually, everybody should be aware of all these rules, actually, what is controlled under what. Although this Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act is there regulating the pharmaceuticals, cosmetics and other things, but the maximum MRLs for the pesticides are regulated by the FDA. So there are some differences and you should be very aware and read very thoroughly. So I'll recommend just only on depending on the cassette and Dul books actually, because I also read it for the first time. The Hayes book, they have a very good chapter on the regulatory toxicology actually. And it is not only regulatory toxicology, it is basically use of toxicology in the regulatory process, how it is used. So that is very elaborate, and because there is no separate chapter in his book on the principles of toxicology or risk assessment, everything is covered in the regulatory toxicology. That is use of toxicology in the regulatory process. So you should be thorough in that actually and read it. So pesticides are actually regulated in the under EPA under two important laws, that is Federal Insecticide, Fungicide and Rodenticide Act. That is, you have to comply with this act for a pesticide to be marketed in the United States, and definitely a tolerance, that is MRLs, which sets the allowable level of pesticide residue in food for human consumption. So that is covered under the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetics Act. That is under EPA. And this is also a very important act, Food Quality Protection Act actually. It's a major act and most of these guidelines are actually formed by EPA or published by the EPA are under this act. That is the Federal Food Drug, FIPRA, that is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide and Rodenticide Act, and again a Food Quality Protection Act 1996. And all these elaborate guidelines are available under the different CFRs. I'm not going into the details, some data requirement. This is I copied from the EPA website actually. Different studies required. So product chemistry, product performance, and then there are toxicity studies, then environmental fate studies, residue chemistry, other studies. Some field studies are also required. These are required for pesticides, for new molecules, and then there are different categories. These are some of the physicochemical properties required by these EPA test guidelines, and these are the guideline details. For under toxicity studies, there are different studies required by the EPA specified. I have not mentioned all these guidelines actually, but the categories are like acute toxicity, subchronic, chronic toxicity. The people working in the CRO are very much aware of all these guidelines and other things, details. So mostly these are toxicity studies, although ecotoxicology is not mentioned in this because this is copied from different FDA actually requirement, and then ecotoxicology is not part of that. So ecotoxicology is required only for the agrochemicals. Very few countries ask the ecotox studies or EFATE studies for the pharmaceutical products, I mean. And while studying the regulatory toxicology, while reading the regulatory toxicology, you should be very clear that although toxicity studies are required or regulatory toxicology is required for 4 or 5 different products, the requirement or the testing protocols or the study design or the risk assessment that I have already mentioned afterwards in the next slides is different because the exposure pattern is different. So the study design or testing protocol and risk assessment pattern is different for pharmaceutical. It is different for the agrochemicals because the route of exposure is different. The way the human being and the environment or the animals come in contact with these products are different. Medical device, it is different. Cosmetic product, it is different. One of the important law under the EPA, that is Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention actually. Earlier it was called as OPPTS. Now they have changed the name. They have issued the harmonized test guidelines for all toxicology testing that is done under whether it is a FIPRA, Federal Insecticide Fungicide Rodenticide Act, or for TISCA, that is Toxic Substances Control Act for chemicals. So they have issued separate guidelines, different guidelines. I'm not going into the detail of these guidelines, and they are categorized again in the acute, subchronic, chronic, genetic, neurotox, and other tox. EP has attempted to harmonize these guidelines as per the OECD guidelines most of the times, although there are few differences in sometimes, or rather there are no much difference in the parameters studied, but the presentations or the expectations of the EPA, the report formatting and other things, there are some differences. So while designing the study plan or preparing the reports, actually, one should take care of this. What is the difference actually? But most of these EPA guidelines are harmonized with the OECD guidelines for all these. One of the most important aspect of the regulatory toxicology is the classification and labeling of the products. And this classification and labeling, when I say, is mostly for the industrial chemicals and the agrochemicals, not for the pharmaceuticals. Actually, the classification pattern is different in pharma, that is not there in the actually not there as per the agrochemical. So this is a standard classification, and we normally use the CRO people, and CRO people are aware that globally harmonized system of classification is there, and based on that, this is not the job of a study director or the persons working in the CRO. It is a job of regulators based on the results of acute toxicity studies in animal experiments, particularly in the rodents, via different routes: oral, inhalation, dermal, and skin irritation and eye irritation. These agrochemical products are classified, and that is one of the important part actually. And in most of the times, the questions will be there on these actually classification systems. And WHO has elaborate guidelines for this classification, and most of these, not EPA, but in India and EU, they accepted the WHO classification systems. And all these agrochemicals or industrial chemicals, they are actually classified based on the acute toxicity data, mostly extremely toxic, highly toxic, moderately toxic, and slightly toxic. So normally in the CROs, we don't come across this type of classification and labeling. We just mention whether a product is, what is the toxicity level, or what are the different values of toxicities. Then for industrial chemicals, the important law is the Toxic Substances Control Act in USA. In EU countries, mostly the OECD guidelines are accepted, although there is a REACH regulation in Europe now. I'll just highlight that. This Toxic Substances Control Act actually regulate all chemical substances imported in the United States, except for the substances already regulated under the EPA Act, that is pesticides, tobacco products. These are, or food and drugs are and cosmetics are already regulated by the FDA. So these are not regulated under this act. Only the industrial chemicals like paints and intermediates and other chemicals, major industrial chemicals, they are regulated under this law. And the first major amendment was done to this act in 2016. Whereas in European Union, there is a REACH regulations. Actually, I have not mentioned in details about this, But all these industrial chemicals are regulated under the REACH regulations by the ICA or European Chemical Agency. And this program actually the EU started this program and implemented from the 2008. And then there are different guidelines actually for the REACH registrations, depending upon the volume manufactured or exported in the Europe, or rather imported in the Europe. There are separate testing requirements and separate dossier requirements for the under the REACH. For 1 to 10 ton manufacturing or import is a different regulations are there. For 10 to 100 ton guidelines are regular requirements are different. For 100 to 1000 ton something actually, and there are elaborate REACH guidelines in the ICA website actually, European Chemical Agency. And those European Chemical Agency or REACH regulations are very well actually covered now in the syllabus of the ABT. Then there is hazardous waste. As I told you, two primary statutes under the EPA are regulating these hazardous waste. That is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, 1976. Again amended many a times, but this is the original act. And the Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act in 1980. Under these two acts, the hazardous wastes are regulated. Then under the occupational safety, you have already heard elaborate discussions under the OSHA, that is Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That is a 1970 Occupational Safety and Health Act, which requires the employees or workplace people for safe working conditions and to set the occupational exposure limits. You have already heard these limits. What is OEL, occupational exposure limit? What is TLV, I think, threshold limit and other things. I have not mentioned many details on that. So this under the Occupational Safety Health Administration, actually, there are separate permissible exposure limits, and these are set by the OSHA, and there are many a times questions actually. Although it is under the EPA, it's a separate act, Occupational Safety Health Administration, and the permissible exposure limits. And you have already heard the details yesterday that compliance is measured with 8-hour time weighted average and 40 hours per week, or maybe 30 years of working life. And they have already decided the TLV levels. Again, industrial hygienist, that is American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, publishes the recommended but exposure standards known as the threshold limit values. So please remember this. Under OSHA, this American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, they publish the TLV values, and these are accepted by the regulators. Then Consumer Product Safety Commission, it is for all other consumer products. It's a separate act under the EPA, which regulate the products, all other consumer products, apart from not the pesticides, not the pharmaceutical products, other consumer products. And the important mention under the Food Drug Cosmetic Act is the Delaney clause. And every year there is a question on this Delaney clause by different ways. Actually, they don't ask the direct questions, but you should remember that Delaney clause was actually implemented in 1958, and there is a special provision that prevents the use of any food additives that have been found to induce cancer in human or animals. So Delaney clause is very important. Then there are some animal welfare requirements mentioned by the regulatory, because these are again the regulations. You have to follow the Animal Welfare Act also. You just cannot conduct the studies as per the regulatory guidelines required by the regulatory authorities. You have to follow the animal welfare requirements, and these acts, whether it is EPA, whether it is FDA, whether it is a CDSCO in India, or whether it is a Central Insecticide Board, they always mention you have to follow the animal welfare requirements. And then there are some questions sometimes how the IAEC or institutional committee is formed and other things, but you should know the details of the Animal Welfare Act. Many times the question is asked about the composition of this IUCAC or the approval process of the IUCAC. There are certain regulations laid down by this animal welfare. under this act actually, and they are available. And it's the same almost like the CPSCA in India, or I see that's under animal welfare. There are 5 members. One is veterinarian, animal research scientist, one is a non-scientist. Then that is social labor member in India, we call it. Then individual not affiliated with the institute, that is a biological scientist from other institutes. So you should read all these actually regulations. It's difficult to mention all the regulations of animal welfare regulations, but there are under USDA, these animal regulations are again defined very well under the USDA, that is United States Department of Agriculture. The most important part of the regulatory toxicologist or regulatory authority is basically a risk assessment, because that is the ultimate purpose of all the toxicity studies. And based on this only they can, based on the risk assessment only, they can decide whether the product is to be allowed for marketing or restrictions, or there are some labeling requirements. It can be allowed to specifically restricted purposes or banned also altogether. So that is the main thing. And there are 4 important phases. I'm not going in the detail, but I'll mention for different products. That is hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization. In the syllabus, that is the ABT handbook, there are 4 different units they specified, and the weightage, maximum weightage is given to the risk assessment. That is, out of 100 marks paper, 38 marks are specifically allotted for the risk assessment. And again, they divided these marks actually weightage for hazard identification maximum 13, and other dose response assessment, exposure assessment, and risk characterization like 8, 9, 8, 9, something like that. So maximum weightage is given for the risk assessment actually. And again, in applied toxicology also, there are some questions on the risk assessment or regulatory. Risk assessment for, as I told you, for different products, it is different. Although we use the almost same guidelines, like acute toxicity, we use same guidelines like OECD 423 or for OECD 425, or maybe for OECD 428, we use say for 28-day studies or maybe ICH guidelines, but the risk assessment parameters are different. In pharmaceutical products, we establish the therapeutic index and safety margins. In exposure assessment, consider dosing regimen, patient population, and metabolism, that is the ADME data, or biotransformation data, or ADME data, we can call it. And risk characterization again, and risk benefit analysis is critical for approving and labeling of these pharmaceutical products. In risk assessment for agrochemicals, it is basically hazard identification is based on the toxicity, not only to the human, not only in the animal studies, but toxicity to human. The clinical trials are also taken into consideration. Then non-target organisms and environment, that is ecotoxicity, effect studies, physicochemical studies, and other. And non-target organisms also, of course, the beneficial insects and other things. Then dose response assessment is, there is no therapeutic index or margin of safety calculated here, whereas it is a no observed effect level or no observed adverse effect level is calculated in the for agrochemicals risk assessment. Again, exposure assessment is different because pharma, it is a intended route, but whereas in agrochemicals, it is by the all routes. So it can be occupational, that is dermal, oral inhalation, then dietary and environmental exposure through for the residue purposes. So this exposure assessment is different. So risk assessment criteria are different. Risk characterization again is regulatory limits like maximum residue limits are set for these agrochemicals, not for the pharmaceutical products. And the principles are different, I can tell you. Principles are different. For medical devices, again, the biocompatibility is a major issue. Leachables and extractable or degradation product is the issue, which is not for other products because the route of exposure is different. Then dose response assessment is not a major issue. It's basically a quantitative or semi-quantitative, and it is based mostly on the adverse tissue reaction because dose is not important here in medical devices. Whereas exposure assessment, duration and type of contact with the body tissues or fluids, that is the biocompatibility studies we carry out in different for medical devices. And risk characterization again is a integration of toxicological and clinical data, not only on the toxicological data, like a pharmaceutical product. Then risk assessment for cosmetics. It is basically the not only the whole product, but the ingredients are also actually evaluated for the hazard, and including the sensitization, irritation, and systemic toxicity. All these parameters are important. Dose response assessment based on the concentration and frequency of use. The dermal exposure is primarily important for these cosmetic products. And again, there are different factors are applied for the vulnerable population like the kids, children, and geriatric populations. Then margin of safety calculations to ensure the safe use, which is not calculated this in the actually agrochemicals or the medical devices. And then there are compliances actually. In European Union, basically this EU cosmetic regulation is there for risk assessment of the cosmetic products. The hot topic, I just want to mention, I'm not going into the details because actually I'm not an expert in that, and there are many experts here. But you should know the risk assessment of nitrosamine impurities, and there is a specifically mentioned in the syllabus the impurity risk assessment of the impurities in the pharmaceutical products, and this is a very hot topic since 2018 actually. It's a nitrosamine is a general. These are the impurities in the pharmaceutical products. First time actually observed by the FDA. And these are divided. The FDA has identified many nitrosamine impurities, first identified in 2018. And they actually identified this 2018 first time in some products like which are already marketed for years and years, like valsartan, metformin, or ranitidine. And then they decided actually this rule is actually imposed. And then there are ICH documents, Health Canada documents, and also the EMA documents are available for risk assessment of, and it's a different issue actually. You cannot use the same principles or same method for risk assessment of nitrosamines which you use for the pharmaceutical product, that is other products. And these nitrosamines, the major concern in nitrosamines compounds are potent genotoxic agents in several animal species, and they are also classified as the possible or probable human carcinogens, and they are classified by the ICH guidelines and even the EMA guidelines as cohort of concern compounds. I'm not going into the detail of these requirements because many people, those who are working in the actually pharma industry, they are very much aware that the risk assessment for the nitrosamine impurities, how critical it is, and how the regulatories are giving the importance to it. And after 2018, initially the FDA thought it is there in the few products, then they banned the marketed products, and now slowly and slowly, because of these developments in analytical techniques, many other pharmaceutical products which are already marketed, FDA observed that there are different nitrosamines are detected. And then FDA recommended that the drug product manufacturers, basically it is a responsibility that they should conduct the risk assessment in collaboration with the drug substance manufacturer, because the sources are different. It can be during the manufacturing process or through the raw material, through the storage. So manufacturer is also important. Drug substance manufacturing is also important, and the drug product, that is the final product. And the risk assessment should include the evaluation that may introduce the nitrosamines, including the water used for the manufacturing process, then cleaning and validation procedures. And then there are different regulations, and lot many documents are now available. And I think the ABT candidate should be aware of all these nitrosamine impurity. There are ICH guidelines are very clear on this, and some EMA guidelines. And then there are separate testing requirements like enhanced EMS test. It is required only for the nitrosamines, and it is accepted by the OECD now. You cannot conduct or characterize the nitrosamine impurities with the traditional OECD 471 EMS test. So you have to use the enhanced EMS test actually for characterizing the nitrosamine impurities available present in the either whether it is a drug substance or the drug product. And there are different sources of nitrosamine impurities, and now there are many. I think more than 30 nitrosamines impurities are detected actually, and already published in the guidelines. I'm not going into much details. There can be a raw material contamination. It can be a degradation of drug substance or drug product, as I told you. Solvents is a major source sometimes. Then water, excipients, or even the processing, because for forming a nitrosamines, there are certain conditions are required actually. It should form there is some secondary, tertiary, or quaternary amines, acidic conditions, certain temperature is required. So processing is also very important actually. Then during the storage also this can be formed actually. And this is just an example that actually acceptable limits are suggested by the FDA. There are ICH guidelines. This is initially they observed that there are only major 6 nitrosamine impurities, but now there are many. Now there are many. This is actually 2018 guideline, M7 guideline, that is ICH guideline impurities. But now there are many, and there is always a question on this acceptable limit of these nitrosamine impurities and the processes and other things. I'm not going into the detail of these nitrosamines impurities. And these limits, one should be very clear that these limits are applicable only if the drug product contains a single nitrosamine. Because for NDMA, suppose NDMA, I think it is a, I'm not sure what is that NDMA is, but long form. But if it is present and if there are, it is a N-nitroso dimethylamine, then N-nitroso diethylamine, so many other names. If there are 2 or 3 nitrosamines are present simultaneously in the drug product or drug substance, this acceptable limit for that nitrosamine is separate and the risk assessment criteria are separate. So one should be aware these limits and the processes or the risk assessment process, because it's major part of the regulatory toxicology. So just to end the topic, more short topic, that is because OECD guidelines, EPA guidelines, EMA guidelines, they have specifically mentioned about the some softwares actually used for the risk assessments. So they are very much now going with the artificial intelligence. So what is this artificial intelligence in toxicology? And definitely this artificial intelligence is transforming the regulatory toxicology or risk assessment process, which is followed for last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And the main application of artificial intelligence in regulatory toxicology is, as we are aware, that it is in the QSAR, that is quantitative structure activity relationships, or maybe some literature mining also, because a lot of literature data is required for the risk assessment or QSAR, and this automated literature mining is a part of this artificial intelligence. And of course, the new approach methodologies are aligned with the international guidelines now. And regulatory agencies like EPA, as I told you, even the ICA, because they are more worried about the non-animal test or non-approach methodologies. So they are explaining the AI-based methods, and they are already published to support the risk assessment process. And then there are different OECD toolbox is available, and then EPA also on their website they specified, or it is available freely, that is some tox cost or the tox 21 programs to analyze the high throughput screening areas. So major applications are in the, as I told you, in the QSAR, read across approaches, that is analogs with the known toxicological profile. You need not go for that for animal studies unless you do the read across approaches. It's very important part of the risk assessment, and those who are working in the risk assessment are very much aware of this. Then some toxicogenomics data analysis can be carried out with this AI. Then high throughput screening is very, very important actually. Again, I am not going into the details. They have some specifically mentioned US EPA models for chemical. They have mentioned on their websites. And the emerging trends are like integration of AI with in silico, in vitro, and in chemical methods for testing as well as for the risk assessment. Use of digital twins for virtual toxicity testing, very upcoming area. I'll say actually few lines on this. Then there are some softwares, as I told you, that expansion of open access and other things. What is this digital twins for virtual toxicity testing? Actually, it is basically, it's not only in vitro or something in silico, it's creation of AI-based replicas of biological systems. Like it can be a human organ, it can be a tissues, or maybe even it is a entire organism is created with the computerized softwares. And then it is used for predicting the toxicological response, again with the help of AI. So it's a virtual model of the organism or the tissue or the organ that exactly mimic, or sometimes with some differences, that a real biological system in structure and function, so that it's a it's really a transformative, I can say. It's a very important advancement in the regulatory toxicology. And it's not that the once you start using the digital twins, you can always continuously update with the help of AI. You can update the structure and function depending upon the results you get actually. And currently, although very few are accepted for the preliminary screening, early prediction and toxic effects, all the people are working on with the regulatory authorities to accept the data generated or screening data generated with the digital twins. Just to summarize the regulatory toxicology talk, actually, it's very general overview. It's not a detail these things, but everybody is aware of the descriptive or mechanical, that is experimental toxicology, what we do in the CROs. That involves the toxicity testing, which helps us to understand how toxic or at what level the drug or any chemical is toxic. Whereas regulatory toxicology uses this knowledge received from the descriptive or mechanical toxicologist and applies it to protect actually the humans or the work environment or the animals and the environment. And this involved a process called as risk assessment, as I told you, with the four major steps, that is hazard identification, dose response assessment, exposure assessment, risk characterization. And to evaluate the risk, regulatory toxicologists rely on wide variety of studies, and these are generated in the by a descriptive toxicologist or in the CROs. And then these regulatory toxicologists, they derive different values. Although I have not mentioned because it is part of the risk assessment, actually, there are different reference doses, acceptable daily intake, maximum residue limits, and point of departure or NOEL, uncertainty factors or occupational exposure limits. All these actually values are derived based on this data. And these different agencies, whether it is FDA or EPA or it is occupational health and administration or it is any country's agencies, basically they use these values in different areas. So it's a regulatory toxicology is the bridge between the laboratory doing the studies and the actual society where this data is used. I think I summarized this in short. If there are any questions, I have put some questions actually at the end actually, but I think we can maybe you can just go through those questions. Some 10 questions are already there included in that.
Thank you, Dr. Pore sir, for your the
Maybe if you
informative and
want,
the
you can go
everything.
through these questions, and these are actually some of these. Sorry, TBS. These are the major references I used actually for regulatory toxicologies, and it was difficult to put it, but you should know the pesticide registration, the regulatory requirements, pharmaceutical regulatory requirements, agrochemicals of major countries actually. And these chapters from this, as I told you, from the heads, very elaborate chapter, and the regulatory toxicology from cassette and tools actually. And these are some of the guidelines because you have to review the guidelines, all these guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pore sir, for your informative and the was important point and the examination perspective in clear and easy to appreciate knowledge and
Actually, your voice is breaking, actually, Drupal.
hello. Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So thank you, and we appreciate the valuable knowledge you have shared with us, and you have shared the very clear-cut exam point of view discussion. And now we open the floor for question and answer session. So participant can directly ask question to our speaker.
Hello, sir. Good evening.
Good evening.
This is Madhav.
Yeah.
Actually, I just want to ask, just can you are having a so great experience in regulatory toxicology. We are so happy that you have taken the lecture. So you are very nicely explained also.
Actually, just that's
Just,
what actually I'm fully aware of the testing, toxicity testing, risk assessment. I'm
yes,
still learning actually, and I want to really learn the risk assessment part.
yes, sir, yes, sir. So my
Yeah, please.
question is that can you just give overview on the for vaccine, which guideline we have to use for recombinant protein, which guideline we have to use for the for the drugs, biopharmaceuticals, as you told, the DCJ and OECD for the you told like so. Can you just in brief
For
can you because sometimes
biopharmaceuticals, there are guidelines from the ICH guidelines are there, and EMA guidelines are there. Biopharmaceuticals again, Indian guidelines are also of course there. But if you are going overseas globally, you have ICH guidelines. For recombinant products, separate guidelines. Actually, number I don't remember now, and EMA guidelines. And for vaccines, WHO guidelines are very much very good guidelines, and ICH guidelines are also there under FDA.
okay, and for this one for this food product and is there any guideline is available?
For food products, actually, there are US FDA requirements are different, but they mention specifically. But IFSA guidelines are clear, and IFSA accepted the OECD guidelines actually, but they have mentioned some specific. Basically, IFSA and FDA, what they do, they give the requirements, not the guidelines, but they say that you can use the OECD guidelines. Like US FDA will ask for certain products for food additives or nutraceutical products, acute toxicity, 90-day toxicity, and mutagenicity studies. So they normally tell that you can use the OECD guidelines. Even IFSA is asking for the OECD guidelines
Okay.
because
Sometimes
the
when you are plan.
requirements of regulatory requirements are different and the guidelines are different.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
I understand. Sir, sometimes what happens, the when if you suppose you are planning for the ocular toxicity or something, there is no guideline is available. At that time, how to approach for preparing the study plan and study report? Can you give little bit
No,
view
for
on
which
this
for aflatoxin,
ocular toxicity study?
ocular
No
toxicity.
guideline is. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah. Ocular toxicity, actually, there is no separate guideline for ocular toxicity, but you have to design the study plan based on the OECD guideline and include some specific parameters like uh, for nasal
By
toxicity,
reading
for otic toxicity, for ocular toxicity.
research,
There are
by
guidelines
reading some research
available.
article.
Huh?
Research article article also it will work or not
Yes,
research
yes, yes.
by reading some.
But most of the parameters you can always take from the ICH and OECD, and then you include the specific parameters related to the eye or related to the ear, some specific assessments actually, or related to the maybe nodes, something.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. But so
Yeah.
many guidelines are, and even DCGI guidelines, NDCT rule
They
is
have some
so
mention
many
about
like.
ocular toxicity and they have mentions, but
Well,
parameters are
but
not
not.
specified.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
sir. Very means there are so many gems are there. We cannot
Yes, yes. Yes,
properly
yes.
prepare the study plan also, sir.
Correct, correct.
But thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Hello, we got the one more question in the chat box from the
No,
Venkat
this
Amra.
somebody actually said OECD 492. It is for the acute toxicity.
Okay.
It's for the acute irritation, not for the repeat dose.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clarification. I also had a question, if I may, since I have unmuted myself already.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for the wonderful session. It was very informative and kind of refreshing. Uh, I just wanted to maybe know the opinion on one thing that I came across. So we have been aware how sulfanilamide had its implications when it was introduced in 1937 first, and the company, the messenger company, and the scientists that came up with the formulation, that elixir, committed suicide as well. But still, recently we have seen the incidences of the same solvent, DEG, being used in cough syrups. I guess it was cold drip something, yeah, in from Kerala. So though CDS has already implemented tests and halted the distribution, but what do you think was the primary negligence or something that made that adulteration go in the market, and how
It's
is it possible? Sorry, yeah.
it's
Please go ahead.
basically regulation should be very stringent actually. Regulatory process should be very stringent.
So it's something that did
Yeah,
not yes, yes,
it's not properly monitored
monitored.
by the regulatory authority, I can say. It's
Okay, so it's core case of negligence and not
yes, yes,
anything else.
yes, yes, definitely, definitely. They have pharmacovigilance department. They collect the samples from the drugstores and then they test and other things actually. But it should be controlled at the manufacturing level and packing marketing level only, sales level.
Thank you for giving.
That's what happened with the nitrosamines and many other things.
Yes, yes, exactly. Thank you.
So from participants, one participant raised his hand, then they can unmute. Yeah.
Yes, hi, I'm Crystal. I wanted to thank Dr. Pore for such a nice lecture. Thanks very much. And the nitrosamines, I put the link in the chat to the FDA's published limits because they moved that table that you showed us, I'm sure you're aware, to their website where they distinguish between the small N-nitroso structures and also the NDSRIs. And the
Yes.
website is more comprehensive. They talk about whether it's based on the CPC or compound specific limits. And I just want to take the opportunity to really thank Alex for the tremendous amount of work and generosity. There's really no other word for it. I think it's incredibly thoughtful and generous of all of the speakers to dedicate 2 hours every single weekend, whether live or recorded, and to do so at no cost. I don't think this has ever been done. It's unprecedented. So I think you should really be proud
Yeah.
and,
Yes.
you know, feel very appreciated by the community. So I just wanted to say a thank you all the way from Belgium.
Yeah. And nitrosamine is a hot topic, and there will be 2-3 questions in this during the this examination, definitely. But I don't want to give any attention to the ABT candidates actually, because reading all these documents, nitrosamine documents, very many documents are available. Regulatory documents, I mean ICH guidelines and EMA guidelines. But at least you can read one guideline of ICH, latest one actually, that is M7R1 guideline at least, and understand the limits and other things, sources, and risk assessment procedure.
Sir, we have one more question from Miskin. So they asked about very recently a cough syrup again lead to a DEG levels.
Correct.
Though there are the several agencies who are regulating, but still showing this type of issues. Any light on that?
It's basically adulteration, I can say. It's not monitored. It's not in the proper level, or maybe the quality of that solvent used. No, it's not good actually. It is basically that quality is not good. Levels are definitely high again, because again that is a regulatory issue, but quality also. So it's a regulator should take the very strict action on that actually.
Okay. Two more participants raised their question.
And pharmacovigilance department should be very strong actually. In between the DCGI or Indian government, they started the pharmacovigilance separately, but now there are no people actually to work, and that it's not working. Basically, people have to report it or maybe something, but after the date, what is the point of pharmacovigilance? No, If there is some side reaction or anything, then it is okay that the drug store or people should report it. But it's very, very weak in India, pharmacovigilance.
Okay, sir. So
Yeah.
two more participants raised their hand. So please unmute and directly ask question.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Myself, Arpan, this side, Arpan Vishwas. So, sir, I had a question. Is there any specific guidelines for designing toxicity studies for ocular formulation, any novel formulation, such as for acute and chronic design? Is there any guidelines to which we should follow?
No, acute actually no. What happened? Actually, OECD guideline, there is a eye irritation guidelines are already there actually. OECD 405, OECD 437, OECD 492, OECD 4. There are many other guidelines for acute, but these are basically for the chemicals. Chemicals.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. But you can always use as a reference, and ICH guidelines or any other guidelines, you have to design that. As I told you, if you want to go, it depends, because pharmaceuticals, what ICH guidelines or FDA guidelines say, depending upon the actual use in the clinical regimen, you have to design
Yes.
the studies. But if you are designing 28-day study and if it is for 3 days or something, then there are guidelines. If you are designing 90-day study, you can always take help of the OECD guideline for other parameters, but you have to specifically include the eye-related tissues
Okay, sir.
or parameters.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
This is Ratnesh. Thank you very much, Dr. Pore. It's very informative sessions, and really appreciate Alex' generosity and creativity for doing this lot of lectures. So really appreciated all these things. I have two small questions. Probably it's related here. The one is like there is a different regulatory guidelines like OECD, ICH, WHO. They create it. The second portion of this one is like the regulatory agencies, the FDA and all, right? So how the guidelines says a lot of the regulation and here and there how we can conduct the test, and the agencies are like accepting those tests or not. So there is a little how they integrate each other,
No,
and
because
are they accepting
WHO
all these
guidelines
things
are
or not?
mainly for the vaccines. Only for the vaccines, they are not used for the chemicals, because OECD guidelines are for chemicals and other things. But
Right.
yeah. So vaccines, you can always use EMA, WHO or ICH guidelines. But if you want to register the vaccine, particularly in India, you can always use the WHO guideline and definitely the CDSCO guidelines.
So the agencies
It
are
depends,
accepting
because
all these.
it's a regulatory authority of each country, no? It is very difficult that all the regulatory authorities will come together. At least there is some system of harmonization. You can use at least ICH and OECD guidelines. You can combine the protocols. But if you are registering any chemical in the USA, or then you have to use the EPA guidelines also. These guidelines are again different, although they are at par with the OECD guidelines. So it's
Right.
always
Yeah, that's what the
better to
integration is.
prepare a study plan combining all these guidelines.
That's great. Sir, second
Yeah,
question is
but
very
OECD
important.
guidelines are very detailed. ICH guidelines, they have not specified any parameters for repeat dose studies. So you have to take from the OECD guidelines. What are the clinical chemistry parameters? What are the different tissues to be the organ weights and other things actually. So you have to combine the guidelines.
Right. And I believe these are the OECD or ICH or WHO. These guidelines are for drug development process. However, the FDA like the after drug in not only the drug registration, but also like the following the ADRs and all. Like once the drug in the market, they also regulate something and they have different
Yes,
guidelines
yes,
for that.
yes. There is a post-market surveillance and regulations are already there after marketing.
Very good. Yeah. I
Yeah,
hope these
that's
are
what the
also relevant
nitrosamine issue
for
came up.
our
That's what the
exam.
nitrosamine issue came up, and it came up in the US actually, basically, and then Europe. The products in already in the market for 20 years, like metformin and valsartan, actually, they now came up with the impurities like nitrosamines, which are very highly carcinogenic and mutagenic. And now many products are coming actually.
Perfect. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Now we take one last question.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello, sir. Vimarsh here. It was very informative presentation. Thanks to you. It is just a kind of out of the syllabus kind of question. So with the Trump administration coming into the role, and they are highly going behind the funds which are routed to government authorities, like including EPA, FDA, and all, there seems to be a bit of agitation in the industry. And also, India pharmaceutical sector is now imposed with 100% tariff and on all. So, how do you see the overall market will turn out for the pharmaceuticals, sir?
As of now, it's for the API, not for the generic products. It's for the new molecules. So people are not much worried, but I'm also not much aware actually what will be the exactly impact actually, exact impact. Because
That's why if you see
for
this
them
in,
also
yeah.
it will be difficult. They are still working on that actually. They will also, because lot many products are available in the US market, all manufactured in India and many other things. They cannot just afford to ban those products if we decide.
And also, if you see the scenario which is evolving in the European Union, although ICA is very strongly making rules and regulations, some of the countries in the Union itself is going against their decisions. And if you see the overall view of green policy and all those things,
Yeah.
which are like indirectly aligning to these regulatory suggestions in the ICA, but some of the countries are going off the track. They are trying to go for more of industrialization and all those things, and trying to bypass, like counter these higher tier regulatory segments, which are very highly imposed into the industry, where industries are facing too much difficulties in their role of production or maintenance and sustenance and all those things. Although it is good that the regulator is deeply thinking into the safety part of consumers, but background, it's a like double-edged sword, where like you have to think that industrialization also is a background which is needed. And so this may be like, if any inputs you have on the overview in the European scenario, to be helpful.
No, absolutely, I'm not aware. But the ICA is basically regulating the industrial chemicals. And the main purpose is basically to avoid the adulteration or maybe the spurious chemicals, because many products in India, there are many pesticides. I can tell you many, not pharma as of now, but at least pesticides, many pesticides that there actually, which are not very low quality and not controlled actually. So that is what is the purpose of ICA. That's what I actually think.
Thank you, sir.
And basically, these industrial chemicals were not regulated earlier before REACH.
So, just to add on question, sir, when can we expect some control on the industrial chemicals in India?
It's India REACH is there for last 10 years actually, but they are not yet implementing. I don't know. Committee was formed actually, there is a booklet also is available on the India REACH actually, but I don't know when it will be implemented. And it's not. It's under the Ministry of Environment and Forest. Ministry of Environment and Forest, basically REACH regulations, like the Turkey REACH and the Korea REACH. Actually, there is a India REACH also is coming. Actually, committee was formed, but I don't know now. But it's not yet implemented. It's not implemented anything. Industrial chemicals, there is no regulation for veterinary products. Although people say veterinary products, but still veterinary products, food additives, at least FSSAI is there to some extent, but it's not controlled. These are not controlled. Veterinary products anybody can manufacture and sell in India like anything.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, Drupal.
Hello, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this very engaging sessions and the very grateful discussion here. And now it's time to share the two special announcement and on behalf of the organizing team. So first, all participants participation certificate will be circulated by the end of this November, and there will be available through a Google Drive link for the everyone easy access. Yeah, and second announcement you can see here on the our desktop. Yeah, and Second, I am delighted to inform you about the upcoming the international Asia level the conference organized by Society of Pathology India from the 7th to 9th November in this year in Bengaluru. And the theme of conference is the navigating the adversity and advancing non-clinical safety assessment for the innovative therapeutics. And interestingly, for early career scientists in the toxicology working in the CROs and the pharma, the toxicologist of the India group is extending the financial support to help them to attend this conference. So this is the very great opportunity whosoever working in the CRO and very at the early career, so they can grab this great opportunity. For the sharing this conference, uh, who should attend? So a study director, study personnel, toxicologist, management person, student, research scholar, a regulatory scientist, pharmacologist, and a toxicologist, pathologist. And in this conference, so many international speakers and delegates are coming to join, and poster sessions also there, and very in Asia level award also there. So it's a great opportunity to attend a toxicopathology session in Bengaluru. Thank you. And lastly, to all our DABT aspirants, we hope you gain meaningful lessons from ToxMaster class series. Best wishes to for the upcoming examination. And the participants are the welcome to share their the valuable feedback here in the live session or on the later hour in the LinkedIn post. So you can directly unmute and quickly share your the feedback here. So whosoever attending the upcoming DABT examination, and hope they get the fruitful information from these lectures. So, and the Toxmaster Class India announcement group name will be changed as the Toxicology Forum, and the group will be open to a post toxicology related information from today. So we can discuss there in for our the toxicology field. And with that, we officially came to end today's session and the final day of the ToxMaster Class Series India 2025 series. On the behalf of the entire team, I would like to once again extend our the deepest gratitude to Dr. Mukul Pore sir for his the valuable time and for sharing his rich experience and the insightful lecture on the regulatory toxicology. And we also sincerely thanks to all our uh, participants, all our the speakers, and for the mm, making this 2025 DABT class series many meaningful and the discussive manner. A special thanks also to our the sponsor for their continued supports throughout this journey. And finally, a big thanks to all of you, the participant, for joining us, asking thoughtful questions, and the making this series so engaging. Have a great night ahead, and we looking forward to welcoming you again in the next year sessions. Thank you, everyone.